So just before we get into it, I'm still recovering. My brain is going to be a little bit frazzled as I am just trying to practice speaking and thinking at the same time. It's very weird, I know. Enjoy. What's going on, guys? On July 15th, 2024, Team Farang, one of the titans of parkour clothing businesses, announced that they would be closing down at the end of this month. It's quite alarming. I've noticed over the last few years there's been a lot of parkour clothing brands and businesses closing down. And although in this short video that I'm doing, I could spend ages talking about other forms of business like facilities and coaching organizations and stunt performance, in this one I'm just going to be talking about clothing brands. So over the last few years we've seen an alarming amount of parkour clothing brands shutting down. If you think over the last 5 years, we've lost Lachette, we've lost Etrefort, we've lost Storm Freerun. So there's been quite a lot of parkour clothing brands closing down, and they're the brands that at one point would have been one of the titans within the parkour industry. And Team Farang's impact on parkour is great. If you can watch their videos from the last sort of 12 to 13 years and some of the clothing that they've made and everything that they've done, there's people on Instagram going through their comments saying that they thought that Team Farang was going to be the Vans of parkour. There's no denying Team Farang's impact within the sport has been so great. But a lot of parkour brands have been closing down. Some of them have announced, like Team Farang, like Etrefort, they announce that they're closing down. And some of them don't. And I've got a couple of examples here. So before we get into the other stuff, I'm just going to say here that this is the Team Farang post that they put up, saying that they've been quiet on the fashion side and coming up with bad news. After 12 wild years, they're hanging the hats up on the operation, saying it's, part COVID cash flow or post-COVID cash flow issues, but also shifting responsibility from the team, like having babies, different jobs, etc. But over the last few years, we've seen an alarming amount of parkour brands closing down. If you look at Salgado's comment here, it says first Etrefort, now Farang. Well, let's go back to Decathlon. So Decathlon are obviously a high street sports company. Obviously, it just shows how many parkour brands are closing down at the moment. Again, that's Alfred Scott's comment there. I thought you could be the Vans of parkour. And there's so many comments boosting Farang. But normal brand, for example, last post, 16th of April, go through the links. Website expired, okay? And we also have Breach, okay? I don't even think, when I check this, there's no website for Breach anymore. Let me have a look at this. No, there is no website for Breach existing anymore. So we can assume that Breach is gone. Okay. Motus, they did announcement on the 17th of December 2022. Obviously finished at the start of 2023. Closed down. Apart from, say, your Stora and a couple of smaller businesses, what is there left within parkour now? The essentially the financial side, at least with the brands within parkour, is dying, and it's having quite a slow, painful death. And I think there's a number of different issues for this reason, and I'm going to go through them, and I'm just going to kind of splur off some of the things that I think. But obviously, like Team Farang said, post-COVID, there's been so many problems. By the way, I do run a parkour clothing brand myself, so I'm going to talk from my experience and kind of pull on that. Obviously, post-COVID, there's loads of cash flow issues, particularly through COVID, which I think is when a lot of them started to close down. Obviously, people were losing their jobs, or they were put on furlough, and they didn't have as much of an income. And of course, because of COVID as well, a lot of warehouses closed down. A lot of shipping stuff took way too long, especially if you're shipping overseas and internationally and stuff. It takes so long because of the virus, basically. And I think that, given that a lot of parkour businesses, even those big ones, even like your Farangs, they're still small businesses in the grand scheme of things. We're a very small market and we're a very small audience. That something like a COVID is enough that it's going to wipe your cash flow down, your income. And obviously, if people are not working, they're not going to have money to spend on your product. And I did see that a lot during COVID, especially from my business perspective. It just dipped because no one was buying. Of course, as well, like because of that, because of like the COVID virus, there was increased rising costs in clothing businesses. So it was more expensive to get certain products, and if you were kind of printing on blanks, there was a lot more for certain colours, and it was very difficult to get hold of some colours, and the prices just did ramp up. You know, if you're a small business, those prices ramping up is enough that it's going to make or break it, especially if you don't sell enough of that specific colour. You should have your financial situation with the business sorted, but obviously things can happen, and a lot of small parkour businesses aren't run by businessmen, they're run by individuals that want to do something. I know Tim Farang didn't use blanks, but they worked a lot in factories, and I can only imagine that, you know, following on from COVID, at least until 21, 22, it was difficult to get something made in a factory quickly because of the virus. I think that as well, unless you're a brand that's in the US, the UK, or like mainland Europe, I think it's quite challenging for you to grow and scale. I've kind of spoken to a few people about this before, and they've said that, you know, if they're not in mainland Europe, the UK or US, it's very difficult to scale because you're having to ship your product everywhere else, and that can be quite expensive, which again was another thing that I noted was shipping costs. You know, there's a lot of money, and I think especially in parkour, people within parkour are very much like, you know, you pull the example of what would you spend, and you know, thinking like, oh, that's going to be way too much, so maybe I'll just knock it down so I can sell more products and stuff. And that's a very bad way to do it. I also feel like there was a bubble. I feel like we were in like a parkour fashion brand bubble very recently. And what I mean by that is there was one point where there were so many parkour brands around. You know, 2019 was probably the year where I think there was the vast majority of parkour brands around that were still existing, and now there's not too many. And I just feel like for back then there was too many brands for a small market, right? You got to think of, yes, the sport of parkour is growing, but were there too many brands for the amount of individuals that were in the sport? And I think that's a big thing as well. I think customer choice is good, but obviously also if you've got so many going on at once, there's going to be too many choices for the person who's shopping, and obviously the person doesn't have that much money for it. Yeah, so I'll just write down at the end there, too many options, and people just wanting functionality over basic items. So my brand is guilty of this, but only a few brands like your Farangs, like your Storers, your Storms at one point were making like functional items for parkour rather than just printing on a t-shirt or a hoodie. Are kind of still here. I know Storer have kind of reverted back to doing that to some degree, but they're also creating their own stuff in a factory. So I know a lot of people are looking more for functionality over like those basic items, but there's only a few brands that have, I guess, the financial position to do that sort of thing. And yeah, I feel like obviously the brands can be doing more to, you know, I guess change the way that parkour clothing is seen, but I do also feel like the responsibility comes from the community, who are somewhat a little bit frugal, but obviously if you don't have money, you don't have money. That's not what I'm trying to say, but I feel like if we're looking at supporting things, we need to be supporting them, and if you can financially support a brand, please do so. Like, I feel like we need to be supporting our small parkour independent businesses, because far too many of them are dying, and it's very, very alarming. Be keen to hear your thoughts. There's a bit of a ramble. I'm trying to get back to thinking and talking from my brain injury. So this is probably a bit of a off the cusp, straight to upload situation. My brain is absolutely frazzled and fried. So be keen to hear your thoughts below. And yeah,